Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TargetSmart podcast. I'm your host, Albert Morales. This podcast is all about lifting up the partners we work with across the country. In the coming weeks and months, you will be hearing from members of the TargetSmart team, candidates, campaign managers, and party leaders, all of them eager to share how their respective campaigns are going. In that time, do not hesitate to send us your questions, feedback, and ideas for our upcoming episodes or anything related to data, such as voter registration trends, polling trends, or anything we're seeing in the field. Perhaps there's a guest you would like us to bring on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the TargetSmart podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, or watch us on YouTube. You can email the show at the TargetSmart podcast at targetsmart.com. That's the TargetSmart podcast at targetsmart.com. We recently sat down with our inaugural guest, Tom Bonier. He is the CEO of our mothership, the Terra Group. Tom's been with the company for many years now and has been an integral part of its meteoric rise. He's also known as the guy who got it right in 2022 when many pundits were writing our obituary. Tom has spent over 20 years working in Democratic and progressive politics, working with campaigns in all 50 states, as well as several countries overseas. Tom's campaign prowess is marked by notable achievements, including orchestrating successful Democratic congressional victories and spearheading targeted state-coordinated campaigns. He has provided strategic consultancy to a myriad of campaigns, including prominent figures like Senators Cory Booker, Elizabeth Warren, John Tester, and Tim Kaine, as well as President Obama's historic 2008 campaign. Tom has also served as an adjunct lecturer in Howard University's Political Science Department. Before we get to our conversation with Tom, I just wanted to point out that when we recorded this episode, I was having a minor technical issue with my microphone. My apologies for that. But the good thing is Tom comes across loud and clear, and he's the guy you really want to hear from. Now, without further ado, here is our conversation with Tom Bonier. I've had the privilege of calling Tom a friend for over 20 years now. He's a man that needs no introduction, known as the guy who got it right in 2022. Tom's been with TargetSmart for many years now. He's now the CEO of Terra Group, our mother company, and he oversees not only TargetSmart, but a great other number of companies under our umbrella. And with that, Tom, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about, walk us through the evolution of TargetSmart and how it came to be the most coveted source for voter file data within the Democratic Party's ecosystem.
Yeah, I'd love to. And first, Albert, let me say how much I appreciate being here with you and being, I guess, the first or one of the first guests on this awesome podcast. I've been a fan of all the content you've been producing for a long time, so it's good to get the call up. So TargetSmart, I'll give you the short story, but TargetSmart has been around for almost 20 years now, a couple of years short of that. And so TargetSmart, the one thing that I say that I think makes TargetSmart unique is that TargetSmart was founded by four partners, sort of two who came out of the progressive political world, and then two partners who came out of the consumer marketing world, consumer data world. And so basically, the thing that makes the company unique is that it takes the best of both worlds. It takes this knowledge and know-how of the progressive tech world and sort of knowledge of campaigns and what their needs are and how they operate. But then it also takes the best practices of the consumer data world. So we've always seen this sort of leapfrogging in politics and in progressive data and tech, where folks in that world would kind of see something that was happening in the consumer data world, and they would say, let's adopt that. And then we'd see politics sort of leapfrog the consumer data world, and they would be looking at politics and saying, well, how do we do what they're doing? So the unique thing about TargetSmart is sort of pulling both of those elements under one roof, which has meant that TargetSmart has always been on the cutting edge in the world of political data and tech by always looking for what's next, looking at what clients are doing, looking at what the challenges that campaigns and organizations are facing, and going out in innovating to make sure that they have the tools that they need to win. And so that's the evolution that I've seen, where first, I joined TargetSmart in 2015. For the 9 years before that, I was able to work with TargetSmart as a client or an ally, and I've always been a huge supporter and admirer of what TargetSmart has been doing, how the company has evolved. And to see that evolution really not just continue, but accelerate, especially in the last few years, as you see the demands and needs accelerate, as we've seen the stakes raise in these campaigns as they become so much more dire, to see the company rise to that challenge and make sure that the Democratic and progressive community has the tools they need to rise to that challenge has been really gratifying, and to play some part in that has been really special for me.
Well, TargetSmart's footprint on campaigns is vast. As a result, you see the data being requested from state and local candidates all the way up to presidential campaigns. So, given all that you see from your perch, what excites you the most about Democrats' prospects? This November that isn't necessarily getting reported on, because all we hear is polls and polls and polls and polls.
That is really what anyone wants to talk about is polls. You're right. To me, you mentioned sort of that range of races from the top of the ticket. It's not just that people are only focusing on polls. It's that people, as you know, are focusing almost exclusively on the presidential race. That's for a good reason, right? Again, the stakes of this presidential race couldn't be higher. I think people are getting a little bit fatigued because they always hear this election is the most important election ever. But truly, we've been living in an era where every election is the most important election ever. So yes, that's getting the attention. And obviously TargetSmart is playing a huge role in that to ensure that President Biden and allies who are working to make sure that President Biden returns to the White House have the tools they need. But you mentioned the fact that TargetSmart has this footprint somewhat uniquely that goes all the way down to the local level. It's a cool thing that the company has scaled these sorts of tools and solutions. When you think about analytics, voter modeling, polling, when you think about what the company is doing on the digital data front, digital media, ad buying, these tools that have previously only really been available to campaigns that had massive budgets at the top of the ticket. And for them to be able to now have access down in local races. And the company does a lot of work with state legislative caucuses or people running in local city offices and that sort of thing, as well as congressional, Senate, and presidential. So when I think about this election, yes, I'm very focused on the presidential election, but I'm also excited about the opportunities that Democrats have to pick up state legislative chambers. As we know, it's incredibly important. It's something that the Republican Party, frankly, did a better job with over the last decade at least, and they picked up a lot of state legislative chambers in 2010 and used it to their advantage, really, frankly, to rig the system to their advantage. It's why they've been able to hold on and pass a lot of regressive policy. So I see this as an election as an opportunity to turn that around. So I'm excited about that too, really, in some of these more local and state level races to begin to see more of that turnaround happen.
So on that note, what does a punditry class that goes on these cable news channels every night often get wrong? And can you share the consequences? I could share one of my frustrations. It happened recently. A few weeks ago, one of the political rags ran a story about a purported poll they had done that was 100% online, but the sample was large enough to where they could break it down into various segments. In that, they claimed that 50%, roughly 40, almost 50% of Latinos in this country favored Donald Trump's mass deportation strategy. That didn't sound right. I get it. On a good day, a Republican can get 40%. On a really good day, they can get even higher. Case in point, 2014, but we won't go there. My frustration there is that, as you started digging through the methodology, you found that 100% of the survey was done online. Well, that sent that sent a red flag for me right from the onset, because I remember a few years ago during the COVID pandemic, I was working for a polling firm, and we were doing a series of polls in the Latino community, trying to get to the bottom of what was impacting them the most. And one of the findings that was really depressing, and we saw this play out on television, was that roughly almost 40% of Latinos in this country didn't have a stable internet connection at home. Oftentimes, this was their source for the internet. Well, if you're a family of 4 or 5 with 3 kids needing to do their homework online, that created a big problem for us. And I think for years we're going to start seeing the repercussions of this. So my point being that, they did not include this cross section of voters who don't have, who would know, who would, first of all, just wouldn't take the survey, but they ran with it. And, to my question, you have these pundits coming out on these cable news networks preaching it, then it becomes gospel. And all of a sudden, 50% of Latinos support, Trump's mass deportation. And it's very hard to walk that back if you're not backing it up with data points. And too often, some of the people that come out on these programs aren't necessarily data experts. So could you share with our audience your views on, the misses that we are going to see and what voters can do to sort of, do their own, make their own judgments?
Yeah, well, that's a great example. I mean, this gap, this void between perception and reality has grown every cycle. This cycle, it's bigger than it has ever been. I think it's really accelerated. You give an excellent example in terms of problems with polling, right? As we know, as we've seen, the great team we have at TargetSmart does a good job with this. The notion that you have to go out and collect data, what we call multimodal, right? You can't just collect data in one method, otherwise you'll have significant bias with any mode of collection. Your example, right on the nose, but like, let's think about the amount of ink that has been spilled in the last week on the New York Times polls that everyone has been obsessing over. Well, those polls, look, they're good polls in general. They have a pretty good track record, but they collect all of their data through cell phone calls. So similarly, you're not going to reach everyone on cell phones. I looked at some of their match rates and the data they're using, which is not TargetSmart data, by the way. And some of these younger, low propensity voters, as we call them, those who didn't vote in 2020, they only have cell phones for 13% of those voters. I will note on the TargetSmart file, the coverage is much closer to 80% for that same universe. But the point is, when you have the universe where you begin, you've only got, like 1 in 8 of them you'd actually have a phone number for. Never mind that when you go out to call them, you're going to get less than, say, 0.5% will actually answer the phone. But then, to your question, what's the problem in the punditry? We don't take any of that with a caveat or a grain of salt. We treat it as if it is the gospel truth. One of my biggest pet peeves, and this is going to come across as super pedantic, but I think it's important, is this obsessive focus on who's winning or who's losing. And you hear this all the time. You'll look in the coverage today, you'll look at it tomorrow, you'll see, Trump's winning in these states, Biden's winning in these states. No one's winning. No votes have been cast. No one's winning until people begin to vote. But we have to treat this as if it's a sporting event, and we want to know who's up, who's down, when in reality, as you know, having been in and around Democratic campaigns for a long time now, campaigns are built to be ahead when it counts on election day. And so some of these campaigns might have what appears externally to be a slow build. They recognize that most voters don't want us in their living room, so to speak, for 6 months. They want to tune in when they want to tune in, but realistically, they're focused on things that they view as more important to their everyday life at this moment. They don't have the opportunity to go out and vote on Trump versus Biden right now. So they're not going to check in. So I think the punditry, this sort of hyper obsessive focus on who's up, who's down, and then secondarily, as you note, then taking the polls as if they're the absolute gospel truth. Every election, we go through the same cycle, at least since 2016, where we hyper focus on the polls as if they're a perfect depiction of exactly what's happening in a race. After the election, we see, wow, a lot of the polls were really bad.
I was thinking of a friend who, big Yankees fan, he was texting me the other night that, oh, we won the last 10 of 12 games straight. That epitomizes
Yes.
some of these pundits that are, it's like, dude, it's not September.
No, it doesn't. In the end, it doesn't matter. What it matters is who wins the last game, right? Like similarly in elections, it's who wins when all the votes are counted. And so, again, everyone falls into the same trap where after the election, we say, wow, the polls were off. We shouldn't be putting the same sort of stock in all these polls. We should be able to sort of parse through. They're going to give us a general directional sense, but they're not going to tell us exactly what's happening. But then the next election comes around and it's as if we've all forgotten and we make the same mistakes again. So, that's my biggest issue with the punditry is that sort of focus and sort of short-term memory loss, it seems.
You were in the minority of experts, and I say minority of experts plural, but I don't recall many others calling the 2022 midterms accurately. A lot of folks were preaching doom and gloom. What were you seeing that others weren't? And fast forward to 2 years later, what are you seeing right now? And I think you may have covered this already in our previous question, but what were you seeing back then that people were either oblivious to or just ignoring?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I want to give credit to my friend Simon Rosenberg, who the two of us were on a bit of a lonely, deserted island.
His name is Simon. We call him Simon in the Latino community because Simon is credited with being one of the padrinos, the godfathers of Latino engagement when he was.
He is gonna love.
He started that out.
He's gonna love hearing this, and I know he will.
I know it's Washington people. We have our our fan base, but I'm a big Simon fan. He's good people. Simon. Anyway,
I'm right with you on that. And so, and the one thing I will say is, and Simon and I have both said this, is in the end we weren't making a prediction. What we were doing was pointing to the predictions others were making and the data they were relying on, and we're saying, we're not seeing the same thing here. And I think this is super relevant when it comes to even the 2024 election. In the same way, is that in 2022, you had pundits who were looking almost exclusively at polling data. And they were saying, well, look, the polling looks bad for Democrats. When in reality, you had a lot of Republican agenda-driven polls that looked bad for Democrats. What we were doing is we were widening the aperture and we were looking at a lot more data. It's one of the benefits that we have at TargetSmart. And so I don't hold it against a lot of the pundits because they don't have access to the type of data that we have. But we were looking at voter registration trends to see who was registering to vote. New registrants is a good sign of intensity. We were looking at special election results. We were looking at primary results. We know that thinking back to that election, Democrats were overperforming past precedent in these special elections by an average of about 7 points. We were looking at eventually the early vote data. So we collect the data, the early vote data, basically on a real-time basis, starting when votes begin to be cast, believe it or not, as early as September in some states, looking at who was voting. Another great sign of intensity. Tens of millions of people in that midterm election voted before Election Day. And so what we were saying is, look, we're looking at all these different indicators, fundraising be another one where Democrats were outraising the Republican opponents. We've lived through red wave elections. We know what they look like. And none of that data looked like a red wave election. The polling data, even the polling data, wasn't looking like it looked like in 2010 or 2014, but everyone was ignoring that because they had their own biases, and they also expected the polls to have a pro-democratic bias, which in the end they didn't. We see people falling into that same trap in this election. So what are we doing? We're looking at the same data. We're looking at voter registration trends. We're looking at the primary election results, where you see Donald Trump continuing to have this stubborn issue where, somewhere between 15 and 20% of Republicans continue to vote for Nikki Haley long since after she dropped out of the race. We're looking at, eventually we'll be looking at the early vote data. And so you're seeing a lot of these same indicators that are perhaps, if not contrary to the polling, providing some really important context. And that's the sort of data that we'll continue to look at as we get closer to election day.
So could you draw any parallels between the 2024 presidential election to any other? I mean, the one that comes closest to mind, I guess, is the Clinton, Perot, Bush campaign, where you had the wild card of an Indy. But
yeah. I mean, as you know, political analysis, like, it's part science, part art, and a big part of what any analysis or even prognostication, maybe in a better sense than we were using a moment ago, it relies on past context and comparing this election to how it's similar to previous elections. The challenge is, even though we have elections quite often in this country, you're still dealing with a very limited set of elections. And so in the end, what we do is we pull from different elements, as you said, looking at a potentially, somewhat significant third party or multiple third party candidates on the ballot. We do have to go back to the 92, 96 presidential races, which is a ways to look at the potential impact there. There are other elements that obviously don't apply to that. So we're pulling from other elections as well. Obviously, the 2020 election is valuable, but that was a very unique circumstance, and that it was happening in the midst of a pandemic. And you had this historic expansion in voting access, which in several states, as you know, including your home state of Texas, have actually rolled that back. Places like Georgia have done the same. So that'll have an impact as well. And then, the last element, and we can get into this more if you want, but there's the Dobbs decision, for which we have no precedent in terms of, we certainly have the limited experience of 2022, but that was a midterm election. This is the first presidential election we've had since Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Dobbs decision, June 24th of 2022. And so the impact that is likely to have on this election, we don't have a great precedent to go back and say, well, this is what happens when a 50-year fundamental human right is struck down by the Supreme Court in this presidential election. We don't know exactly. We've got some good clues we can look at, but that's an important consideration.
So we have the first of two presidential debates next month, and I was looking at the date, and it's 3 days after the anniversary of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. It's like nobody at the Trump headquarters realized that we're going to be coming off the heels of this anniversary. And what were they thinking? But more important, what are you going to be looking for? I think it's unprecedented. It's earlier, before any of our conventions. What are your thoughts?
I mean, first of all, I'll say, without straying too far into punditry, I think it was actually a brilliant move by the Biden campaign to really hem the Trump campaign in the way that they did. I think it was a very smart move. In the end, they have to perform in the debate. I believe they will. But to your point, it coming right on the heels of the Dobbs decision is no accident, and also potentially on a court decision in his court case. It could happen a little bit before then as well. To me, an important element of this is, when we look at the polling data, there's still a significant portion of people who currently say they're voting for Donald Trump who also say they believe abortion should be either completely or mostly legal. And for Donald Trump to win, keeping in mind, if we're starting from the foundation where he lost last time, he needs to find a way to expand his electorate. He cannot win without fairly substantial support from people who oppose the Dobbs decision. And when we look at the polling, there's still a lot of, I don't want to say confusion, but maybe misinformation out there, or doubt, in terms of who is actually responsible for the Dobbs decision. And it's hard for us to believe, all of us here who are hyper-focused on the presidential election, that anyone could be confused about it. But the reality is, for a lot of people, because it happened while Joe Biden was president, people are confused about the fact that Donald Trump is really almost solely responsible for the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And so what the Biden campaign needs to do to be able to really put Donald Trump away And I think why, again, another reason this is a smart move is get it out there early as people are just beginning to tune in to this race, which I think the debate will mark that really the beginning of this campaign, despite what we all would like to say about the last several months. And so I think it's a great opportunity to remind people very forcefully and to put Donald Trump on the spot, because we've seen he's tried to strike what he thinks is a middle path on the issue, which is let the states do what they want to do. In the end, he's on the record. He's been bragging about that he was the one that was responsible. And so in the end, most Americans are looking at this and they're not comfortable with even that answer to say, well, states should decide. Most Americans believe that Roe v. Wade needs to be proactively reinstated, the protections afforded by Roe versus Wade. And that's something that Donald Trump is not in favor of, even though people have been focusing in some ways, I think maybe wrongly, on whether or not Donald Trump will put a national abortion ban into place. To me, that's the wrong question. Will Donald Trump act to reinstate Roe versus Wade? We know the answer to that. He won't. And so I think it'll be an opportunity for the campaign to shift that focus, to remind voters of where he is. Now, again, the debate can't and shouldn't only be about that issue. But I think that affords the president a great opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for President Biden to remind voters, or even to inform them for the first time, of the great things he's done as president, that the incredible economic recovery that he has presided over, while also making it clear that the job isn't done and that some people are still feeling pain out there, but that the best plan is to stay the course. And so, yeah, I think this debate is huge. I think it's going to get incredible attention, even though it's happening far earlier, as you said, than any debate has before. And I think it'll be important. I think it is an opportunity to really change the dynamic in this race.
Well, I think that's enough on Roe, and certainly I think the women in my life would rather us take a backseat to this issue, because they are very passionate about it, and there's good reason for it. So it's the day after the election, Tom, and President Biden's just gotten reelected. What are your plans to celebrate? Are you taking a big bike ride across the country? What are you going to do?
You know, it's funny. I always have these great aspirations where I'm going to get through election day, and then, you know, that'll be it. I'm going to check out for a while. I'm not going to pay attention to political news, going to log off at Twitter, maybe delete the app from my phone, come out to your farm maybe, and just watch the donkeys running around through the field and relax. And, you know, the reality is, every time, number one, races are rarely actually over on election day. And I hate to raise that specter, because we all need to think of the finish line as the finish line. But as we know, it's going to take a while to count these ballots. I think we all have to anticipate that this is going to be a very close election. And we saw what happened last time, where really up through January 6th, or even January 20th, if you want to look at it that way, the outcome of the election was in some ways in question and at risk. And so I that's my mentality at this point, is that we have to be ready to not just run through the finish line, but then continue to protect what I believe will be a victory by President Biden. And then I'll find some time to go out there, ride my bike up a mountain, spend some time hiking in the woods, something like that. But I also I just love it. I've got to say, I one of the things that is so exciting for me after an election, and this is going to look, I'm already exposed as a nerd on here anyhow, but this will expose me as an even bigger nerd. I love digging through the election data. And so I can't wait after the election to get, when our team at TargetSmart collects that vote history to say who voted in the election, I can't wait to get it. And so every time a new state comes out, I'm spending the evening after the kids go to bed, just digging through it to try to better understand what happened. And so, again, that's probably the nerdiest possible answer, but it's true. I just love looking at that data. You were not shocked. You're right with me. Come on.
Yeah, to an extent, but not it's not that deep. But hey, Tom, you've been a great first guest on our new platform here that we're going to be using. I can't thank you enough. We're going to be doing this weekly. In some cases, we'll be doing it multiple times a week. There's a lot to share with our audience. And again, the thought process behind this podcast was to highlight the different divisions we have within the company, not only Terra Group, TargetSmart, from polling analytics to strategic consulting. If you're at home wondering if you want to run for mayor next year, we have a team that specializes in drafting path to victory memos. For example, they can walk you through what your chances are, how much money you'd need, A to Z. So you'll be hearing a lot more of that in the future. But for now, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week as we have a surprise guest lined up, another one. And if you heard my rooster, my apologies. They don't respect
perfect timing.
My space. All right. Signing off. Thanks again, Tom.
Thank you.